morning and good afternoon, depending upon where you are dialing in from today. Welcome, conference attendees. Thank you for joining us today for our sessions on your values, your impact, your stories. I'm your MC for today, Michelle Miller-Burns, President and CEO of the Minnesota Orchestra. It's my pleasure to lead you through today's content. I hope that you are ready to lean into your creativity and your curiosity today. Before we get started with the session, on behalf of the League, I want to acknowledge our generous sponsor for today's session, Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard is a world-renowned acoustics and integrated systems technology design firm that specializes in the performing arts and is a leader in facilities for performing arts education. Thank you so much to Kierkegaard for their support. And we urge you to go and visit them and all of our other sponsors for this conference and exhibitors who have set up shop in the virtual exhibit hall. As we think about how the events of the past year have changed the world, our organizations, and ourselves, it's more important than ever that we are able to express our evolving thinking in a compelling way. And this afternoon, we will explore how we can conceptualize and articulate a new narrative. Up first will be a keynote talk about storytelling, followed by a panel presentation in which we'll explore how we rethink our case for support in these changing times, and then a facilitated chat in which we'll gather in small groups to share what we've learned and to think about how we convert our learnings from today and from our other sessions into actions for each of our organizations. And then after a break for happy hour or dinner, depending on your time zone, we'll have an opportunity to enjoy a concert by the Interschool Orchestras of New York. Our keynote talk today will explore the role of storytelling as a tool to transform what you do every day into stories that will help strengthen, inspire, and advance your organization's mission and role in building community. To guide us in this exploration, we're delighted to have as our keynote speaker, Kiran Singh, Syrah, President of the International Storytelling Center. So a few words about Kiran first. Kiran describes himself as a speaker, consultant, and peace builder. He speaks about storytelling as a universal form of cultural expression that leads to respect and justice, and ultimately to peace. He has developed workshops for groups healing from traumatic events and provided trainings for humanities and arts commissions across the United States. He was awarded the Rotary International Champion of Peace Award at the United Nations headquarters in Geneva, Switzerland in 2017, and served as a Rotary Peace Fellow in 2019. At the International Storytelling Center in Jonesboro, Tennessee, Kiran and his colleagues use storytelling to address real-world challenges and promote positive change for healthier communities and more effective workplaces. Today, Kiran will offer insight into using storytelling as a vital tool to develop our own narrative, to carry ourselves and our work in the orchestra field forward during this pivotal time. First, I want to share with you that when I sent Kiran an email on Monday evening, I received his out-of-office reply message, which read in part, "I hope you're having an excellent day. I'm currently out of the office as I'm taking a day off. I'm going to Dollywood Splash Country because I love water and I love Dolly. Also, it's always good to take a break for self-care when you can. Please make sure you are doing this as well. Resting and cultivating self-care is also important to become the story you wish to see in this world. If I don't get sidetracked or dye my hair blonde, I'll be back on Tuesday." And that right there is why I want to get to know Kiran better and hear what he has to say. So now, please join me in welcoming Kiran Singh Syrah.
Michelle, thank you so much. As you can tell, I didn't dye my hair blonde. I wish I had hair. It's really wonderful to be here, and it's my first time attending this conference as well, so I really appreciate the opportunity to do that. I've really enjoyed the conferences. I've enjoyed the sessions, the keynotes, the breakout, the small Zoom breakout rooms. But I've really enjoyed the symphonies and the music in the evenings. And that's been really, really special for me to be able to sit and watch that. So I want to just express my appreciation to Heather, to Michelle, and all the team for putting that on, and all the orchestras across the country for doing that. So thank you so much for that. Which is really something I want to sort of build upon as I kind of introduce myself here. And something that I've been reflecting on as I watched those concerts. A long time ago, at a literary festival in Glasgow, Scotland, I met an attorney who was once the attorney for Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and he was his speechwriter. And he told me about how he was classically trained in playing the clarinet, and that he had often used musical theory in his work, drafting his speeches. He described imagining Dr. King as the instrument, and then considering composition and cadence of the words as he worked and as he wrote. I love that little detail because it's a reminder of how all of us across the arts are so closely interconnected. There's music in the spoken word. I work at the International Storytelling Center, so I tend to see everything as a story, a dance, a painting, or a symphony. Those are all stories to me. I'm not a musician, although I do beatbox from time to time, but I strongly feel that we're all doing different versions of the same work. And so I feel very honored as a non-musician to be here talking to you today. I want to start by acknowledging that we've all been through a lot over this past few years, as individuals, as workers who care about the arts. The pandemic has amplified so many problems that we're already dealing with. Climate change, the nasty political divisions, bigotry and inequality. And on top of all that, it's given us a whole new raft of problems, big and basic organizational puzzles, like how can we have a meeting now? Or how can we present a performance virtually? Or even, how can we stay alive as an organization? We were dealing with all these existential threats on top of personal stuff like loneliness and distress and anxiety and boredom. Now, I don't want to downplay any of that because this time has been hard and the pandemic took away a lot of those things. But it also gave us new perspective, and that is very valuable. I'm here to talk to you today about how we can use that perspective as a gift. And I do think it's a gift that can help us build a better world. I always feel like people are rolling their eyes, though, a little bit when I say things like build a better world. And I get it. It's a very lofty phrase, a lofty idea. And to some people, it would sound impossible, perhaps a little daunting. But I think it's important to remember that hope isn't necessarily a feeling. It's a practice. It's a project that we can chip away at, building a better world, a better future. It's something we can do together, one story at a time. And we can do that a little bit each day. A story, just like a symphony or a painting or a sculpture, never stands alone. It exists within a context. Whatever story you hear or read, there are always other stories underneath it, or off to the side. For every account you read in a history book, there are many more that are in the margins, or not on the page at all. In folklore studies, we often talk about digging where you stand, to understand the places where we live. When we hear lots of different stories in this way, we can better grasp the character of a place and its people. We understand their accomplishments, their dreams, and their mistakes. But often, these are the stories that lie beneath the surface, making a place what it is, even when those stories haven't yet been unearthed. At the International Storytelling Center where I work, we're always looking for ways to dig where we stand, and we frame old stories in new ways. Over the past few years, we've worked very hard on an initiative called Freedom Stories, which centered the stories of Black Appalachians in history. These are tales and perspectives that throughout history have been hidden or buried or pushed to the side. We have to keep our eyes wide open for stories like this because they're never in the spotlight. Let me give you an example from my own life. When I first came to the United States as a graduate student 10 years ago, I visited a historic plantation near Durham, North Carolina. The guided tour started at the big house, where the white overseers had once lived. We walked through these carefully preserved spaces, attending to the details of the architecture and the dining room sets that had been made from wood imported from England. We spent most of our time on that tour in the big house. As we moved across the property, we heard fewer stories and examined fewer details. We made our way to a big barn where tobacco had once been stored. Adjacent to it was a small structure that was probably a slave dwelling. As I examined the cement and the brickwork, I could see a thumbprint, and I wondered who it belonged to. Was it someone who had lived there? And what was their story? I think the tour would have been much more interesting if we had started with that anonymous thumbprint, instead of putting so much focus on the big house. It's part of our job as Americans and world citizens to examine those thumbprints, so to speak, and put them at the center of our narratives instead of in the margins. And that's not always easy or self-flattering work, because it involves acknowledging that way too many stories are dark with unhappy endings. At my organization, we've been thinking hard about which stories need the spotlight right now. We know that narratives have a lot of power. In Jonesboro, Tennessee, where we're based, we've seen firsthand the power of storytelling to transform our own community and revitalize our little town. As an arts organization for 50 years, we've thought about stories not just as entertainment, but also as a force for social change. As a tradition, an important part of storytelling is preserving and honoring the past. But the other side of that is that storytelling doesn't necessarily just preserve culture, it invigorates it. A good story will stir things up, it brings up memories, and inspires us to connect with people who we may have felt perhaps isolated from before. I've had a lot of opportunities to witness the power of stories to do all this firsthand. I think a lot of times when people think of storytelling, they think of performers on a stage or perhaps librarians sharing stories with a group of kids. And certainly storytelling is all those things. My organization produces the National Storytelling Festival, which is the big live storytelling event every year, and there are thousands of people in that audience. It's a wonderful long weekend with incredible performers who are masters of their craft. We all have a terrific time. But events like that are only part of the work that we do as an organization, because storytelling isn't just a performance art. It's also a means of exploration and self-expression, and a practical strategy for building peace, justice, and better community relations. A story doesn't have to be a finished work of art that an entertainer performs on stage. We can also think of stories as tools that can do real important work in our everyday lives. Stories help us understand who we are as a people and how we relate to other people and the world around us. You can use a story to tell someone something as simple as what happened at work that day, or to share something more sweeping and profound about your life. Articulating our experiences to the world in this way, having the space and the tools for self-expression is a form of empowerment. That understanding of our own identity becomes the basis for how we understand the people around us, and the people who are further away, and even people who lived a long time before we were born. As DJ Questlove suggests, music has the power to stop time, but music also keeps and holds time too. I think the same applies to storytelling. It becomes the basis of empathy. Part of what we're talking about is having a room with lots of different kinds of people in it, all of whom feel empowered to say who they are. That's the real meaning of diversity. Many years ago, when I was an educational officer at the big museum in Glasgow in Scotland, the director said something that has really stuck with me. He said that when you work in a cultural institution at any level, then you're a cultural diversity officer. Thinking about diversity isn't just for the workers who are hired to that specific end. It's not just something that we should do during Pride Month or Black History Month. It's something that just needs to be part of our thinking all the time. Culture belongs to everyone. But it doesn't always feel that way, does it? Sometimes that's just because of practical reasons, like someone who can't afford a ticket to a concert. Or it may be more emotional, like when someone doesn't feel welcome into a space or just feels like they don't belong. As cultural diversity officers, and remember, we're all cultural diversity officers, I think a good habit is to always think about who's not in the room and why. We have to really work to cultivate this awareness. At the museum in Glasgow, I often work with young interns. And what I like to do during their first week on the job was to give them a bus ticket. And I asked them to go and visit the sights of Glasgow, not just the touristy parts. I wanted them to pay attention to the different kinds of places, building names, graffiti signs, markets, everything. And at the end of the week, I asked the intern to come back to the museum and notice what parts of the city were missing from the museum. Who and what wasn't represented? That became the brief for their internship at the museum, to address that, to find a way to bring them into the room. Just for a moment, let's pretend that you are my imaginary intern. I want you just to now close your eyes and visualize your organizational space. And then imagine taking a bus ride or a walk or an Uber around your community. Who and what isn't well represented in your institution? What and who do you see on that stroll around your town that you need to bring into the room? Thank you. In a way, what we're talking about is representation, right? Our communities need to be able to see themselves in our organizations to feel welcome there. Let me give you an example of representation gone wrong. At the British Museum, all the European stuff is front and center, and all the artifacts from Africa are in the basement. Whether or not the people who designed the layout intended it to be that way, it sends a certain signal about whose stories and whose culture is important. And inevitably, it's going to make some of the people who go to that museum feel second rate or even second class. At the museum in Glasgow, we were always looking for ways to help people feel more connected with our exhibits, especially kids. For one project, I approached the local police officers about working with teenagers who are first-time offenders. Usually police made these kids do community service chores like picking up trash or repainting a train station wall. But I suggested that they assign the kids to me instead. We developed a program where the kids could use their graffiti tagging skills to develop an artwork with a textile artist. This was an elevated and totally legal version of something that these kids have been doing on the streets for many years, marking a space to let the world know that they exist. The difference was the context of the museum, where we invited the kids to be part of our community instead of existing in opposition to it. The stroke of genius with that program was where we displayed the final works. Usually, community exhibits get displayed in the corridors or the museum cafe, set apart from the real art. And that position sends a kind of signal about which art was most important. In our museum, we place the kids' work next to the most famous painting in Scotland, Salvador Dali's Christ of St. John of the Cross. This is one of the most iconic religious paintings in the world. And in some ways, the museum is actually built around the piece. Suddenly, these so-called dangerous teens were now bona fide artists, and they began to see themselves as artists. They had been validated and told their stories matter. The program was a success. As cultural diversity officers, it's important that we meet people where they are. Sometimes it starts with a single act of listening. After I worked at the museum late in my life, I was studying folklore in a graduate program in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. I spent a lot of time at a men's homeless shelter doing immersive research. I was studying home, the aesthetics of home, the idea of home, the search for home, and what that meant to someone who didn't have one. I had my theories, and I talked about them frequently with one of the men that I met at the shelter, and his name was Johnny. He was an older white man with a scraggly beard. In our initial conversations, I made a lot of assumptions about what home would mean to a person like Johnny. I didn't mean to do this at all, by the way. I just did it. But it became hard because it can be hard to let go of your assumptions and just listen. When we talked about the shelter, Johnny focused mostly on his struggles, his dislikes, and the challenges that he faced every day. He had to reach for the words as he explained these difficult and complex emotions. And there was a distance in those words. What he was describing was not who he was, not part of his core identity. It didn't define who he was as a person. What I didn't realize was that we were talking about my notion of home, which I assumed was the shelter. After all, that's where he was living at the time. But as we talked more, I found that Johnny would answer my questions in ways that often surprised me. For him, home was very much rooted in his past, and it wasn't necessarily a physical place, such as the connections he shared with people. As it turned out, Johnny had once been a baker. And often as we sat on a bench and after finishing a formal or an official interview, I'd turn off my recorder and it'd wax on about biscuits and pies that he used to make. The words he used and the content of the conversation became different, more vivid and poetic. When he talked about baking, everything changed. The conversation became more fluid and eloquent. This was something he could talk about with presence and authority. It helped Johnny tell me about who he is in a way that his circumstances at the time were unable to convey. At the same time, I was learning something new. I also found something familiar. I always saw myself in Johnny's stories because, like him, I was constantly using cooking as a way to connect with friends and the broader community where I live here in East Tennessee, in these mountains. We are all in some ways products of our environment, constantly receiving new input. We can change our communities, and our communities can change us in return. Our identities are flexible, always changing depending on context. In England, where I was born, I was called Indian. In Scotland, where I lived, I was English. And here in the United States, I'm British, or sometimes European. And all of these identities reflect the truth in a different way. What I have realized is that none of us is just a citizen of one place. We are all citizens of the world. But the stories we hear about that world often come through broken filters. Every day we're inundated with negative news stories and messages written by people who want us to sell us something, or otherwise they may have an agenda. I believe it's our duty as citizens of the world to seek out the truth for ourselves. Sometimes we can find this truth by looking within, but other times we find it by looking around us and looking for opportunities for fellowship so we can open doors and even break down walls. In 2016, I happened to be in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, when Alton Sterling was shot and killed by police. The shooting occurred just 1 mile from where I was staying, but I didn't hear about it until the next morning. I learned about the tragedy from one of those big TV screens mounted on the hotel cafe wall. It was one of those 24-hour news channels. There was a lot of activity around town, and newscasters were framing it as a riot. The thing was, I was right there in downtown Baton Rouge. I could look around and see with my own eyes that there was no evidence of rioting. People gathered, but it was to pay their respects, not an act of unrest. What I was seeing was a vigil, not a riot. Later that same afternoon, I saw a young black woman with a sign that said, "We are all Alton Sterling." I stopped to talk to her. Her name was Tam Williams, and she was a 24-year-old documentary filmmaker who had grown up in the area. I got her permission to take a photo, which I posted onto Facebook that evening. I thought it was so brave of her to be standing there alone, and I learned a lot from our short conversation, a lot more than I could have learned from just watching that TV back at my hotel. To serve a community, you need to interact with people. You need to listen. You need to dig where you stand. I am always trying to keep this principle in mind of when I'm helping people grow as we develop and refine our own community building programs at the International Storytelling Center. In one youth empowerment program we've developed called Sheroes, we use a day camp format to give young girls the tools to express themselves. We use storytelling and other arts like dance and theatre to help 10 to 13-year-old girls better understand themselves and also dream about the future that they see in the world. The Sheroes program combines elements of folk tales and fairy tales and fables to help the girls explore their identities, their family histories, and the problems that they see around them. At the end of the 2-week intensive camp, the girls stage a live recital where they unveil these fictional characters that they have imagined and developed. It's really something to see. With their creativity, our sheroes learn to deal with the disappointments and anxieties of everyday life. For several participants, anxiety about the future of climate change was palpable. Another participant dealt with a scary episode in her family's life. These simple stories contain rich emotional worlds, helping the girls connect with their families and the wider community, and even process trauma. By writing their own scripts, these kids felt empowered to share and grow from experiences that can be difficult to talk about. We don't teach them how to perform someone else's story. We try to nurture what's already there so they can tell their own. Our cultural institutions have a big job right now, as we help our communities try to better understand themselves and the world. To return to where we started, we've all been through a trauma with the effects of the pandemic. And beyond that, we live in a country and a world where political divisions have grown more and more heated and difficult. I want to suggest to you today that crisis can be a launch pad for better things. Our collective task is to come together to envision a world in which hope, progress, and positive change are back on the table. The arts are a hugely important part of this process because they help us understand the past, even as we envision and shape the future. As Mark Bamuthi Joseph talked about at the start of this conference, we should look to the artists for transformation. But I'd like to build on that. Not only do we look at the artists, we also look at the artistry and the creativity that exist in our communities. And perhaps also by people that don't even consider themselves or call themselves artists. Working towards this goal is what gives our lives meaning. And it will become a legacy that we can pass on to our children and our children's children, and on to generations way past our lifetimes. Our stories aren't static. Our stories are part of living moments, stories in progress that are still being written as part of the collective history. Throughout time, stories have been essential to our survival. We've used them to meet the challenges of war, famine, conflict, and other pandemics. We've learned how to collect, document, and pass on wisdom. We've developed systems of resilience, preserving traditions that others have tried to erase or suppress. I'll conclude with a story that helped bring these points home for me. I was in my office in Jonesboro late one night, leading a video conference training with public health workers and volunteers in Australia. This was the summer of 2020 and the height of the political protests in the US that followed the murder of George Floyd. We were talking about the Black Lives Matter movement, and I learned that there had been a candlelit vigil in Australia spelling out, "I can't breathe," with 433 candles. On that call, we talked about how 432 of those candles were for the Indigenous Australians who had reportedly died in police custody since 1991. The 433rd candle was for George Floyd. Soon after that, when we took a break, I happened to look out my window and see a Black Lives Matter vigil taking place across the street. By candlelight, maybe 100 or so members of my community were reading out the names, the victims of violence and police brutality. Black, white, brown people lined the streets, spaced out 6 feet apart. It was truly a sight to see. It was totally a coincidence, but it was almost as if the discussion from my computer screen had spilled out onto the street and into the night. It was part of a story that spanned continents, and it was still unfolding right in front of me. Often we think of stories as linear, with a beginning, middle, and an end. But I believe it's more useful for us to think about story as a tapestry or a map. Our personal story is just one thread that comes together into the bigger picture, and it's best understood as part of the whole. The personal experience shapes the collective experience and vice versa. They can't be separated. And the story is always expanding, just like the universe itself. We have a lot of work to do. And that work starts with the act of harnessing your own story, sharing it with others, and listening to what they have to say in return. It requires the patience and the willingness to hear and share stories that make us uncomfortable or upset. It requires the wisdom to cultivate the good that's already there, instead of imposing our will and our beliefs on what's good onto the people around us. The causes, issues, ideas, and people we care about are worth fighting for. The world needs your story, and it needs all our stories, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Multiculturalism has always been an American value, and immigration has been very important to this country's history. But human nature and the people who write history books have a tendency to gloss over the parts that are difficult. From the displacement of Native Americans to the horrors of slavery, the story of the United States in many ways is a series of traumas. Different people have experienced those traumas in different ways. Our experiences during the trauma of this pandemic have been a brutal reminder of the glaring inequities that have never really gone away. We need the tools of storytelling and the arts in general now, more than ever, to harvest and grapple with these experiences. We need a better understanding of all the stories that inform our present in order to move toward a better future together. I want to end on a personal note. When I was a little kid, growing up in England, I used to get a lot of grief from the playground. I was one of the only brown kids in our little seaside town, and there were many times when kids would call me smelly immigrant or curry boy or worse. My parents, who fled to England to take refuge from a genocidal dictator, used stories to tell me about where I had come from. When I was a kid, the country of Uganda, where they had lived, was not a place, but a story. India, where my mother's family was from, was a story. There were tales my mother would tell me as we prepared meals together in the kitchen. And she'd tell me what it was like growing up in East Africa, watching her father build a well with his own hands so passers-by could drink fresh, clean water in the scorching sun. She told me about the little hut that served as her school in a tiny border town between Kenya and Uganda, and the dusty road that she would walk down to get there. She told me about the freedom fighters from the rural villages of Punjab in India, where her parents came from. They were farmers and carpenters who took on the world's largest empire and won. These were the stories of places I wouldn't see in person until I was much older, but they taught me about resilience, resistance, strength, courage, and love. Hearing these stories over and over again, I pieced together what these places I'd never seen looked like an imaginary map. Knowing the trouble I faced on the playground, my mother would tell me these stories, and then she would say, "Go back into that playground and go tell them who you really are." And it helped. I think that's really all we need to start building a better world. As cultural caretakers, as cultural diversity officers, because remember, that's what we really are. We need to always pay attention to who's in the room and who isn't there, where we can find them, how can we welcome them into the room, and how can we make sure they have the opportunity to tell us about who they are. Thank you all for listening.
Kiran, thank you so much for taking us on this storytelling journey. As we move into the Q&A portion of this session, I'll note that we welcome and encourage questions from session participants. And to pose a question, please type it into the Q&A feature on your screen. So here are some of the things that I heard you talk about, Kiran. That a story exists within a context, and stories are not just entertainment, they're about affecting change. That storytelling becomes the basis for empathy, and maybe a headline here is around that culture belongs to everyone, but it doesn't always feel that way. So we should be thinking about who's not in the room and why. So the issue of representation is important to consider. So as session participants are kind of thinking about all of those concepts, what I'd like to do is just kind of jump in and ask you a starter question, which is, how can we take this great information that you have shared with us, these kind of concepts around storytelling, the philosophy behind storytelling, and how do we translate that into some tangible next steps in developing our own stories and the stories of our organizations. Like, how do we get started in that process? What might be a good first step for us?
That's a great. My father always said to me, if you don't know where to begin, start by washing the dishes. Start small. But we also know with any art form, to create a masterpiece, you have to work through the broken to get there. It takes practice. And it's the same with storytelling. There's no quick fix. When Michelangelo went to paint the Sixtine Chapel, he didn't learn to paint in a 1-hour workshop on how to paint. He learned the tools and the rules of composition, but he learned to break those rules and apply his soul to create the masterpiece. And I think when we think about our story, this is the hardest thing that you can do in your lifetime because it's essentially unpacking your emotions, your pain, your suffering. But what I would always suggest beginning with is take some time out, close your eyes, and go back to your story of value. Which story speaks to the value of why you do what you do? Spend some time really cultivating that and thinking through it. Journal, close your eyes, meditate, pray, whatever you need to do, and go deep into yourself and find what were the moments or the experiences or the places or the people that led you to what you do today. And I think that's a good starting point. And don't worry about it being a personal story. I need to tell someone else's story, because your personal story is about you're helping to inspire others. You're helping to create a personal story about talking about the movement, the cause, what matters to you. And so the personal story is your value. But then the next phase I would suggest, and comes from a lot of Marshall Ganz's work, the story of self, but the idea of moving your self story, your value story, to the story of now. What's going on right now? What organization? How does it connect to the mission, to your movement, to your church or mosque or your community or your hometown, to where you are right now? What is that story? And the third, and I think that's kind of really important, it takes a lot of thinking, is how does it work with the story of purpose? So the story of self moves into the story of us, and then it moves into the story of now. You imagine Greta Thunberg, it's climate change. Emma Gonzalez, who witnessed her friend being killed by gun violence, it's gun reform. Using personal narrative for a change. So thinking about that wider, the three interconnected, your story of self, the story of us, the story of now. And spend some time really going through that process and allowing yourself to understand what was the people, the person, the event, the experience that made me lead. I'm not selling cars. I'm not working on Wall Street. I'm in an art form that's about making and enriching people's lives. Why? And I think that's a really good place just to start the process. And remember, it's hard work. You'll cry, believe me, which is good.
Kiran, thank you. Thank you for that, for walking through that idea of starting with the story of self and some self-reflection, moving to the story of us, and then to the story of now. We have a question from a conference participant. Kiran, you spoke of broken filters for stories. If cultural organizations are also a filter of a kind, what are some basic principles and commitment for not being a broken one?
Wow, that's a good question. That's a brilliant question. And I need to think through that, because you're right. It is a broken filter of a kind. You can somewhat suggest political government is a broken filter of a kind. I understood America from what I heard from TV and from the president and what's on the little magazine that suggests that we go to the Statue of Liberty as our first point when I was 12 years old. But maybe what I should have done, or my family should have done, is start at the memorial to lynching in Montgomery, Alabama, because we know that not everybody came through Ellis Island. So I think what we have to really do, and I believe in this, in the art form of storytelling, it's the sacred. Where can you find out that for yourself? Where can you hear the personal testimonies that are not coming through those filters? And where can you discover and be curious? That's not to say our cultural institutions aren't important, because remember, we go to Holocaust museums because we are trying to understand this human story, how we can be so destructive. We, after 9/11, when all visitor attractions declined in New York City, apart from one space, the Islamic galleries of the Metropolitan Museum, people were curious. They turned off CNN and Fox and they want to find out themselves. And I think it's really important to provide the space, a safe space, where people can meet and connect on a human level. So the broken filter, potentially it could be, but I think it's also remember that it's a tapestry too. And there's multiple stories represented. It's no one single story coming out of this country, and there shouldn't be. There's no one single story that speaks to your organization, and there shouldn't be. There's multiple. It's a tapestry, it's a map, and they all matter.
Kiran, we have another question from the group.
I'm really giving a kind of a sermon here. I want to imagine, anyone want to know why my hair's not blonde? Oh, no, never mind.
Kiran, you spoke of interaction with people as an essential ingredient in serving a community. So is there a storytelling strategy that is key for engaging with an audience that might initially be reluctant or mistrustful of engagement?
Is there a key or a strategy? And I think the Pat Speed, Irish storyteller, said the closest distance between two people is a story. And that's not necessary. We have to think of our intentions. If our intention is to convince another, then that may not necessarily always be the right intention. But if our intention is to listen to the other, then that might be to find empathy and understanding. We know that a flag can be controversial, can be difficult, can be contested. But the story behind that flag is going to be multiple and diverse. There's no one meaning, there's multiple. And I think when the intention is to try and find out what that meaning is attached to it, then there's truth that lies in it. I think but also there's a concept called the storyteller knows me. And essentially, if you can create the story that can tap into something that the audience can relate to, whatever that is, an emotion, a connection, the desire to be loved, the desire to love, the desire to feel a sense of belonging, connection to a community, to feel included, then what you're creating are these universal human feelings, emotions, traits that connect the audience and the performer together. Essentially, that's about allowing the storyteller knows me concept, that you're allowing the audience to understand yourself. But always remember that the final interpreter of any story will always lie in the mind of the listener. I can say so much about how I believe, or what I believe, what you should believe, but essentially the listener is going to be the interpreter of that. So it's about crafting that story in a way that can relate to a value. If you understand your value, then most likely if it speaks to your heart, it's very likely going to speak to someone else's heart too. And I think that's about building empathy, building trust, and then in that space, we have the sacred space of listening, teller, and listener, the exchange.
Thank you, Kiran. Another question has come in, and that is, what devices or tools can we use to create stories that encourage unity and common good as opposed to division and polarity?
I think the documentation process is always really valid, and it's a very good thing to do, because there might come a time in our history where we can reflect back. And I think about the work some of I did were work in Northern Ireland during the conflict, the Troubles, the 30-Year War. And what they were doing was collecting the items, the steering wheels that had got a bullet through it, the dustbin lids that the women would use to signal to the men when the British tanks were coming in, toilet tissue, written poetry by Bobby Sands on the IRA hunger striker while he was in Lankesh. They collected these objects during the height of the Troubles, but they waited and they preserved them. And when the conflict ended, even though the tension was there, they invited the people that had been affected to curate the exhibit. And I did a similar kind of round table after the massacre that took place in Charleston, South Carolina at the Mother Emanuel Church. And it was 6 months after, but one of those conversations was collect the stories around the Confederate flag that is coming down right now, collect the stories of what's happening. And that is a really important process, preserving these stories. So when in 10 years from now, we can look back at that particular moment and curate that space. What you're doing is something that's much longer term. And I think don't also be afraid of what another person can grapple with into the complexities of the issue or the story. We're clever. Human beings are smart. And we have to remember that we want more than a soundbite. And it's okay to have different viewpoints. It's okay to go deeper into it. Don't be afraid of DEI. It's part of all our stories. And I think it's very, but I also think the distrusting part might be you have to also make sure that you are understanding where the audiences comes from, what their needs are, what's important to them, and then kind of make it relate. Just in terms of advocacy, one of my colleagues, who's a folk and traditional arts colleague, she was trying to meet with a senator, elected official, that was a different political party. But she found out that at his church, they had these stained glass windows. And so the first thing she talked about when she went in to talk about arts advocacy was talked about, I know you're part of this community that collecting these stained glass windows. And his eyes lit up. She's basically helping him realize that he was already connected to the arts and folk and traditional arts and traditional. So in that way, they built their relationship from there, at starting point, connecting to what's already important to that community. You might want to talk about it as heritage or whatever. Remember, where I live in Appalachia, there are probably more conservative audience members when you talk about bluegrass, maybe not the musicians. And, it's part of what might call this is our heritage. So you have to find a way to kind of talk about it in a way that people can understand. When I talk about storytelling as resilience, in Appalachia, I don't say it's just a tool. I say it's a value. It's a value that people understand in Appalachia, and people get that. So thinking through those processes, I think is very important to find that, but also making sure that you're going to them because you're creating a safe space. They have to feel comfortable too. Not just for telling stories, but for listening to receive.
Kiran, you spoke about the fact that stories are not static. So I'd love to hear you just say a little bit more about how do you keep a story alive and evolving? Kind of once you have created that story, how do you make sure that you're able to adapt that to changing circumstances, changing times, and a changing context?
I mean, I think a big part of that is changing anyway, whether the story being told today that I might tell, it's already going to change because where I'm living or the time I'm living in is going to be different. And I think I quoted DJ Questlove that talked about music has the power to stop time and hold time, which I also believe is the role of what stories can do too. But the context and place and how we interpret that is going to be different based on what's going on around us. The moment when Johnny was in the shelter, he was living a bit of a struggled life at that particular time. So it's difficult to see. His context was that he was living through a traumatic experience. So that's the lens to which the time and context he was in. How one adapts, one has to kind of, you might. I think it's going to be very, very different to different types of stories or different types of stories that you want to tell. And I think it really, a story you tell now is going to be different to pre-pandemic because you're talking about it in a different context, something that people can relate to. you might tap into talking about helping people emerge from a particular type of experience. When I talk about trauma, I say, well, kind of every kid's gone through a traumatic experience right now, not just the kids that are at risk. Everyone's at risk. So, that context is important. A story is never necessarily static because it's changing based on place and time. But also our story as a nation is changing too. You could argue, I'd suggest that we're in a bit of an identity crisis, which is we're a story in the making. And when we work through that identity crisis, then it's because whose stories is trying to get told and get the front and center. That's kind of why I believe Black Lives Matter is a storytelling movement, right? But I think it's also about being mindful of that crisis, being mindful of the changing circumstances and context. And then, as my girlfriend would say, she's a painter, you work through the broken to get to the masterpiece. And I think that's also very, very important. I would also try to think people, please maybe not think of storytelling as marketing or branding. It's a very different kind of place. Think of it as an art, as a tool that you work at for many, many years to create. And it's not a story to get something necessarily transitional. It's a story to communicate who you are, your values and your purpose. And that's going to constantly change as well. And so thinking about your story that you're telling at that particular time is going to be very different. And you have to try to make it relate to the moment.
So I'm thinking a lot about what you've just shared, and really thinking about like the authenticity of a story. And as people involved in orchestras, a lot of our storytelling over the years has not been about who's not in the room. And so as we think about our values as individuals, our values as organizations, how do we ensure that our story and our narrative moving forward is authentic and comes across in an authentic way as it relates to, as you described it very eloquently, our role as cultural diversity officers? Because it seems like our story now as orchestras might sound quite different than our story from 5 years ago, 10 years ago. What thoughts do you have about that and how to address that authenticity piece?
Yeah. I mean, authenticity is a really big subject, and it's a difficult one often to talk about. How do you create that authentic? Yeah, I think it really much comes back down to what's authentic to you. What is true to you? If it speaks to you and it's your purpose, then it's likely going to be the better story to tell than the organizational mission, starting with that. And I think if there's 100 people that work in your organization, then go through a storytelling process, collecting process, allow time to think through that process for it. And if 100 people could work out why they do what they do, what brought them to that place, what were the people that inspired them, you've got an incredible tapestry to build upon. And there's no one story that you would tell necessarily to convince others, because that type of thing is going to really speak power, truth, connection. Values speak to values, essentially, if you really want to build a movement. And then maybe I think some of that might also be, thinking about how do we relinquish control and power ourselves? Who's historically had the microphone and who needs the microphone now? As a man, historically, I've had the microphone. So part of that, I got to think of different places where I could step back. If I'm white, I'm black, I'm brown, who's had that microphone and who needs that microphone? How can we create space for other people's stories to come to the surface? But also think of our cultural institutions as not separate from the places where we live. They're embedded in those places. And the collective story, the expanded narrative, is one that's not just the story of the institution, it's the story of place, Appalachia, the Delta, wherever that might be, the borderlands. it's connected to that place. And so thinking very broadly about finding those stories, collecting those stories, making those stories circles happen, even in spaces, opening up your space to have free flow, non-linear, uncontrolled, open dialogue, best place for storytelling to come to the surface, where people feel happy, content, and safe to share. I hope that answers it. I think it's a really difficult, it's a hard one to tap into, because authenticity as folklorists, anthropologists, so we think about that a lot, but it really comes from a place of within, I think.
I appreciate your addressing that, Kiran. And it sounds like you are suggesting that the stories we tell are actually not so much about our organizations, but about the people we engage with and a sense of place. So is this sort of the anti-elevator speech?
Oh yeah, elevator went out in the 80s. Totally went out in the 80s. Because also remember, we're smarter, we're more inundated with stories every day than we ever were before, especially young people. They can see through the BS and say, no, they're inundated with stories every day. They can see right through the elevator pitch. But what I would suggest, make that elevator 20 minutes, 2 hours, an epic, and allow yourself to an elevator to break down in the darkness, and you're having an intimate story sharing with someone in that elevator about why you exist, what's your purpose, what matters to you, who matters to you, what you want your legacy to be, what's the imprint you want to leave in people's lives, and what do you want to be remembered for, of making a difference, contribution to the greater story of our humanity. That's the elevator. Do you mean allow the elevator to slow down and do justice to the story that needs to be told? If that makes sense.
It does, Kiran. Thank you so much. And thank you for reminding us that listening is a critical part of storytelling. We are coming to the end of our time for this session, just about 1 minute left. So I'm going to take this opportunity to say thank you to participants in the session, and a big thank you to you, Kiran, for inspiring new ways of thinking about our narrative and thinking about our role as cultural diversity officers. I will end by saying that when I met Kiran to prepare for this session, he commented to me that storytelling is going to change the world. And I think that from the chat that I have seen during the session, that Kiran, you have given all of us a newfound appreciation for how that will be true, and the tools that we can use to start to tell our stories, the story of self, the story of us, the story of now. And I would encourage participants to go to the International Storytelling Center website and utilize the great resources that are available there. So a very big thank you, Kiran, for sharing your thoughts, your insights with us, and for being such an inspiration to kick off today's sessions. And I hope that everyone will tune in again at 2:15 Eastern in just about 15 minutes for our panel discussion. And then, spoiler alert, Kiran will be back with us for the facilitated chat later today, so you will not want to miss it.
Maybe I'll bring Dolly with me. You never know. Michelle, thank you very much for your questions and your patience and your wonderful connection, and also Heather and this is my first time in the LEAD conference, and I might just come back every year. I've really enjoyed this and being part of this community. And so, and do come to East Tennessee, if not to see me, to see Miss Parton, is just very short distance away. But I'd love being here. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Kiran. Thank you all. We'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.